So completely agree with less PowerPoint and more discussion. So I will try to just sort of rapidly go through a little bit of the history and sort of, I think, AVAC's perspectives from our work around the good participatory practice guidelines and just community and stakeholder engagement broadly. And I think just to say, one of the things, one of the really great sort of framing things I think for this meeting that I've been thinking about throughout the 4 days is just how um, community engagement is and engagement of any kind or good participatory practice, whatever phrase you want to, whatever term you want to use, is really this consistent theme and this sort of common principle, I think, throughout all of our work. But it looks so different, it looks so different in every context. And I think that's really the beauty of it. But that's also really the challenge of it. And that's been striking me as I've been listening to all of you discuss and present throughout these days. And just really, really quickly on that note, many of you are probably familiar with AVAC, but many of you probably are not. And so just, we are an advocacy organization. We're based in the US, but we work globally, primarily in areas of the world that have sort of the highest burden of HIV. Our work is around HIV prevention and specifically advocacy, engagement, policy, all of the above around the research and development process for new prevention interventions. So originally the focus was really around vaccines, and now we're much broader to include things like that you are all probably are familiar with, like PrEP, microbicides, and the like. And so we do work, we've collaborated with Wellcome over the years, but just sort of here and there. So again, it's just really nice to be engaged with you all in this workshop and hope that it can continue. And again, many of you are probably familiar with GPP, but just sort of a little bit of background. GPP was developed originally in 2007 by UNAIDS and AVAC, and really as a response to some controversies that I'll highlight in the next slide. To again, as we've been already talking about this morning, to try to provide some sort of a global standard or a global kind of reference point for how to engage with a number of different sort of external stakeholders throughout the research process. And we're going to highlight on this session is really about how to expand GPP and make it adaptable in different contexts. And this original edition of GPP was written specifically for biomedical HIV prevention trials, so things like vaccine trials and PrEP. This is just, again, just a sort of a little bit of a framing of GPP and the structure of it. And I think really to sort of to emphasize, for those of you who haven't seen a copy or opened the book or don't have it sitting by your bedside, like some of my colleagues who are in this meeting do, it's structured in a very practical way. And really sort of the meat of it is this section 3, where GPP kind of walks through the clinical trials life cycle and really helps to sort of articulate what are some of the considerations and what are some of the actual practices to put in place to ensure that stakeholders are well engaged in each of these pieces of a clinical trial or of a broader research agenda. And this is one of our favorite diagrams, and actually really is, Nick actually already presented this in his keynote, so I don't have to go into it, but I think really talks about the breadth and the real diversity of stakeholders that sort of can and should be involved in the clinical trials process. And we define stakeholders as anyone who could be impacted by a clinical trial or anyone who could have an impact on a clinical trial. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about those two different sort of sides of the coin. And I think a lot of times we really think about engagement, GPP, CABs, really at that, in this sort of the center two circles, and thinking about protecting the trial participant and how do we engage with those sort of local trial site communities. But what AVAC really emphasizes is, again, this need to kind of engage at all of these different levels. And I'll touch on that again, and it goes back to sort of the history of the GPP guidelines. And I think a lot of what we're seeing actually play out in current day in terms of focus of the broad public in terms of COVID research, certainly what we're seeing in this country, in the US. So, one I think of the important points to emphasize really is that that civil society, and especially, and a lot of these different stakeholders, should be a partner in the research. I think it's important to note GPP, they say that no set of guidelines gets developed in the absence of controversy, and that is the same with GPP. So back in the mid 2000s, there was a lot of controversy around some of the original PrEP efficacy trials. Those trials actually got shut down. And this was a moment in our field where we said, my goodness, we sort of done due diligence in terms of making sure these trials are approved by ethics boards and IRBs, and follow GCP, but something else broke down here. And that was the engagement piece. And that was this sort of broad civil society engagement piece. And this was really a setback for the field. And people really kind of feel like this delayed research, the moving forward of research, and ultimately the rollout of PrEP and a much needed prevention intervention. And that was when GPP was developed. And I think just to really note that that a lot of times I think we can get sort of complacent with our engagement. And we have sort of our cabs, we have the people that we sort of know are the people that will kind of support the research. But it's really important, I think, to do this sort of broader assessment of who might be out there, who might be asking questions, and where might there be controversy in places that kind of the research enterprise and these external stakeholders, especially civil society, might kind of might not see eye to eye. I'm not going to go into these just for sake of time, but we have a number of milestones over the years. And actually, Stephanie is gonna really touch on the adaptation of GPP, this original set for the TB drug research field. And that really actually was a major milestone in kind of thinking about how does GPP apply to clinical trials much more broadly than just this HIV prevention space. And I think one of the other things to note, and again, I'm just going to sort of breeze through this for the sake of time, but again, thinking about sort of engaging at broader levels, some of the things that we really see as milestones are sort of incorporation of GPP in some of the more kind of national processes. So things in the previous slide, like the setting up this South African National Stakeholder Engagement Forum, very much based on the GPP guidelines.
About 1 more minute, Stacey, sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. I think that I am pretty much, I think those were kind of the primary points I wanted to highlight for the sake of this discussion. I think one thing, just to put out there, one of the things that AVAC does is we, at the more sort of at the global level, we're not sort of working to implement GPP at trial sites. That's done by the trial sites themselves. But AVAC is playing a role to help implement GPP, again, at kind of a global level. One of the main ways we do that is through this online training course, and these metrics are actually even out of date, so the numbers are higher. So if you're interested, we do run an online training course, and it's a great way, I think, to really sort of amplify sort of above and beyond the importance of GPP and just engagement broadly within the clinical trials process. Again, adaptations to a number of different research and disease areas, which Stephanie will speak about more. And these are some of the key issues I think I've already touched on, and actually that the two keynote speakers really touched on a lot. But I think for me, this issue of the fact that engagement is really not a clinical trials requirement, right? And even in our small group, we were just sort of talking about the fact that you could actually probably run a trial in a certain context without doing engagement. You might get away with it. And so what does that mean in terms of this need to kind of require that it happens and keep it up to good standards, but also the need to really let engagement reflect the specific context, because as we all know, that's the way that engagement is gonna be implemented in the best way. And I will end there. Just again, I think these will be shared, so included some resources here for everyone.
Thanks a lot, Stacey. Thanks a lot for that. And please do add into the chat questions and reflection on Stacey's presentation. We'll have some time to come back to questions and discussion after we've had the 3 presentations. So now I'd like to hand over to Stephanie.
Hi, thank you so much, Robin, and thank you everybody for including me and asking me to participate today. It's really nice to be here. I am from the TB Alliance, and TB Alliance is a not-for-profit organization focusing on the development of tuberculosis drugs. For those of you that are unfamiliar with us, I'm not going to be using slides today just because I want to share our experience. But I hope that doesn't mean I end up going off the rails. Slides sometimes help keep us to task. But as a product development partnership, not-for-profit drug development organization, incorporating something like good participatory practice just makes a lot of sense. And I will say that, from for over 12 years, the TB Alliance has incorporated principles of GPP into how we think about engaging with stakeholders. Also, as a not-for-profit drug development organization, we're built on a partnership model, which means that stakeholder engagement and incorporation into all of our projects is something that's absolutely necessary. But I will say that in the TB field, and just to speak to, not-for-profit drug development organization, but we're also we're a trial sponsor. So from our perspective, incorporating community engagement, good participatory practices, at the very beginning of our experience, it was a little bit difficult to incorporate this. I think that there was a little bit of misunderstanding in the TB research world about why community engagement. Some of the challenges that Stacey alluded to in the mid-2000s in HIV prevention trials hadn't really happened in TB drug research because we hadn't had a lot of TB drug research in a really long time. I think that it's just so important that, we spend the time and prioritize the scaling up of participatory practices over time in every disease area. And TB is one example of how we've done that over many years. The adaptation of the GPP guidelines for TB drug trials, I will say, was a team effort from many people that are on this call with us today, and it wouldn't have been possible without that. TB Alliance and AVAC have been partners in bringing GPP and community engagement into the TB research field for many years. And it's an ongoing evolution. I think that part of what Stacey alluded to say that these are principles that we hope researchers and sponsors will follow. And I can say that from a sponsor perspective, it's a real cornerstone of the TB Alliance approach to clinical trials to make sure that at the research site level, there is support and a mechanism for engagement with trial participants, key community stakeholders, and also at the organizational level, a priority to engage with stakeholders on multiple levels, from regulatory, donors, research partners, and others. In terms of our experience having the community or civil society perspective incorporated into our clinical trials, we have also been working through that exercise for many years in many clinical trials. I will just say, just in response to some comments earlier about treatment trials sometimes not necessarily being what patients or communities want, I think that that's a really important perspective, but I think it's also important to realize that clinical trials do bring necessary treatments to different disease areas, and it's our responsibility to educate and sensitize the participant community or the disease-affected community about the reasons why we're testing new products, to ensure that there is buy-in and partnership in the clinical trial process.
Just 1 more minute, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just talk about some challenges and barriers, because I think that's really what is going to be so important to this discussion. When I think about GPP, I think about the roles and responsibilities of all of us that participate in these different aspects of the clinical trial life cycle. And I think that community engagement is typically done at a clinical trial site level, where we're engaging with patients, our participants in clinical trials, and disease-affected communities. For us, it's TB-affected communities. But we need to look inward a little bit more to inside sponsor organizations, institutions, donor organizations, regulatory organizations, ethical review committees, to make sure that we're all taking the role and responsibility that we have to incorporate good participatory practices into each aspect. And that's where it's a little bit more challenging from our perspective. And that's why I call this an evolution of our experience of incorporating GPP. I think we've done a great job of incorporating community engagement at the grassroots level. And over time, we've been incorporating good participatory practices into how we plan and conduct clinical trials from the sponsor level, and really getting into the weeds of clinical operations and clinical planning, and ensuring that GPP is written into how that's done in SOPs and clinical trial agreements and protocol documents, is a challenge, and it's something worth discussing and moving forward. It should be more of a standardized approach to clinical trials, which may require some kind of, international regulatory recommendation at some point, which we currently don't have. It's an encouraged activity, but without that, I think the clinical trial community is always given a way out, and it's our responsibility to really push and encourage the incorporation of GPP in every aspect of clinical trials. I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing from our partner from WHO as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Stephanie. And once again, please do put your reflections and questions for Stephanie into the chat, and we'll pick those up when we go into the discussion. I'd now like to hand over to Lisa Schwarz. You're muted at the moment, Lisa. You need to turn your mic on.
Try to do one thing at a time. So is it okay if I share my my slides with you?
Please do.
I'm going to take up the screen, so I'm going to have to do this a little bit less smoothly than I would have hoped, but that's okay. Here we go. And great. So thanks very much, and it's quite an honor to have been invited even to participate in this session, and it's been a delight to hear the previous speakers. I am here on behalf of the World Health Organization's Task Force on Good Participatory Practices in Emerging Pathogens Research. I'm myself am based at McMaster University, and I'm a member of the co-PI on the Humanitarian Health Ethics Research program. The task force is a group project, so many of the people who you've heard speak in the last days or so are participating in this task force, and we have also representation not just from the practitioners of GPP, but also the clinical trial leads and research ethics as well. And it is a joint initiative from the research roadmap on COVID-19 for both the clinical working group, the ethics work, and the ethics working group as well. So just to briefly put in mind what it is that we started doing. So while there's been strong commitment and a clear realization of the kinds of advantages that GPP brings to the research setting in general. At the moment that COVID-19 hit, a lot of people who thought that good participatory practices and community engagement were usually essential to their work became a bit panicked about the realizations of how can we do this in the process of lockdowns. This paper emerged fairly quickly and I think really articulates the importance to maintain relationships of trust between communities and research institutions. We needed to find measures to, I guess, include and even substitute the measures that we've been using in the past for essential components of our research, which is to include the communities as much and as far as possible. So the COVID-19 restrictive measures diminished all sorts of existing resources and techniques. Also, there was this commitment to rapid timelines because we had emergency pandemic things spreading throughout the world. But with that rapidity, I think it was also a possibility, a way out for researchers to say, we're not going to do this kind of good participatory practice because it's just too hard to invoke. They felt that they had poor access to the communities and couldn't believe that they could do it in the midst of lockdown. There was so little information also to be able to share or even to answer the kinds of questions that communities might be interested in. And then there were just sort of layers and layers of regional challenges, including, the impossibility of crossing borders to send the communication generally. So on top of the usual concerns about poor access, the lack of confidence about being able to communicate a message in general, the sense that they might be out of funds. So it was really interesting to hear from the perspective of a funder just now. Is it possible to do this, or was it also too late? And I heard clinical trialists saying, look, we've got to get, we're down this road, the methodology has been selected, we've got to get things moving. Is it really possible to do GPP in COVID-19 situations? So the task force was brought together. I noticed on Stacey's timeline that it ends at 2016, and 2016 was the document that we were building from. So we grew from that document to this two 2020 documents. These are short. One of them is a toolbox. It's kind of an overview for providing or engaging with communities during COVID-19, sort of a checklist. The other one is a nice, handy overview of how to develop community advisory boards with suggestions, for example, of using existing community advisory boards that maybe had been assembled for other purposes, but which could be repurposed for the rapid research that's being done for COVID-19. And we assembled various different sorts of tips, which you can see here on the left. And very importantly, planning budgets accordingly so that we can include community engagement practices, all the way through to joining with the media, using radio talk shows if we can't do in-person discussions, relying on social media and various other things. But
you've got another minute, Lisa, just to let you know.
Perfect. So one of the key problems that we encountered was the crisis of the pause and stop. So you'll remember with hydroxychloroquine, the trial was suddenly stopped at a moment. They paused it for the purposes of reviewing a critical incident analysis. And then it was started up again, and then eventually that arm of the trial was stopped. So communicating with communities what it means for a trial to stop, that this is not necessarily a bad thing, but actually was something that had been designed into the protocol and was useful, it was anticipated, it was a safety measure. But communicating all of that stuff was problematic. There was concerns about distrust being developed. And so we've developed a document, a new document that's just under review with WHO. which we hope will be out soon, on raising the means and mechanisms for communicating what it means for a trial to be paused, why it could be stopped, and what it means, and what sorts of obligations and accountabilities are associated with that. So if we had an opportunity to talk about anything at all, I think the pause and stop question is relevant. It's being built into the vaccine trials, obviously, going forward. So it's a big issue, and I think it's worthwhile exploring. So these are the sorts of things that we're thinking about next, but I'm going to stop there. That's the end of my slide deck. And hopefully we'll have a chance to chat more about these things. Thanks very much.